thumbs are fucking stupid. I mean, look at these things. What purpose do they really serve? I could get these things chopped off and not even see a difference. Well, I did it. But at what cost? Thumbs or not, you really can't deny that there is a beauty to a nice, well-designed controller. You know a controller is really good when you can just feel the button layout by looking at the silhouette alone. Like, of course that's the f***ing Intellivision controller. Video games just can't exist without them. Even those DVD games that came on a movie disc still needed a remote to work. But it begs the question, what is the best video game controller? Because let's be honest, there are more controller variants than there are types of cheeses. I'm on the quest to find the greatest video game controller, and I will stop at no cost. Except for the cost to reattach my thumbs. That surgery was so expensive! Let's start with one everyone's familiar with. Pong! A little dial that turns to move the paddle. Genius. It's so simple. One function, one movement. Truly, you would have to be a different breed to not understand this simplicity. But speaking of simplicity, the Atari controller. One joystick and a f***ing button. Society is advancing, and it's advancing quick. The joystick is so stiff to move, and I have a hard time wrapping my head around how games could be controlled like this. The addition of the button makes it so games could get wild. Truly a sensation like no other. I feel like the inclusion of this button is great, but also very much awkward to handle. The base is so thick, so it feels kind of hard to hold. Especially when you don't have thumbs. But let's talk about a controller that uses thumbs. That's right, it's a f***ing phone. The Intellivision and ColecoVision both had a number pad. Now, of course, this paved the way for nothing, as everyone stopped doing it the minute the NES came out. The rectangle of justice, as I like to call it. A lot of people hate this controller, and to them I say, do you have thumbs? The NES controller makes sense. You got your D-pad, which was taken from some of the Game & Watch series of games, and you got your buttons, A and B, and they're just right next to each other, so it makes it awkward to hold. But you gotta admit, the controller is pretty good for an early home console controller. I mean, the NES has ever since paved the way for video games, and the controller was also a part of that. So of course, when competition came around, the new kid on the block retaliated and say, hey! We have a third useless button! Call me a f***ing moron because I like the Genesis 3 button controller. A lot, actually. A lot of the problems the NES controller had are just not here. The edges are more rounded, and the controller is bigger. It feels comfortable in my hands, but god damn it, the D-pad sucks! Yeah, Nintendo filed a patent on the D-pad, so other companies couldn't really copy it, so you get shit like this. It's a D-pad, but it feels very loose, and it feels like it could break if I look at it wrong. There's also a 6-button variant, and somehow they made it smaller, and I hate that. It feels so cramped and unnatural in the hands. It's kind of like holding a stick of butter. But let's not forget the one that came before, the Master System. Your controller is Garbo. Alright, Super Nintendo. I gotta admit, this controller, it gets a lot of praise, so let me be the first to say that it's just kind of alright. Look, I'm not saying it's a bad controller. If I did that, I'd be serving 5 to 20 years in prison, and I don't have that kind of time. I have a lunch date on Tuesday. I just think while it's a good controller, that's it, it's just good. It's not perfect. It's kind of small, and I feel like my fingers in the back don't really have any good grip on them. The buttons are kind of small, and the D-pad is really squishy. I don't like squishy D-pads, it's gross. But what if there wasn't a D-pad at all, and all the direction buttons were controlled by just normal buttons? This was a mistake. This was a mistake! It's clear that this was just a repurposed Super Nintendo controller. Like, the layout is the same and everything. I will say, it feels fine in the hands. I like the D-pad better. But why use a D-pad when you can use a joystick? This is so cramped. While I don't own one, I have used a DualShock before, and it feels kind of awkward in the hands. Hard plastic joysticks and like 2 games that support it, so why the hell did this thing ever come out? It also doesn't help that this design was used for the next 2 generations of PlayStation, and if you want to hear my opinions on those, well then tough shit, I don't own them. I gotta say, this hurts just a little bit. Well, you know what comes after that thing? Jesus Christ! Man, I'm full of bad opinions today, because while I know this controller is bad, I kinda like it. It's so absurd, there's nothing else like this thing. I understand the design philosophy. It's meant to be held in a ton of different ways for different games. The analog stick can get crusty sometimes, and I gotta admit, it really is uncomfortable to play with, both with and without thumbs. Sega just kinda went stupid for controllers for a bit. The Saturn was just a slightly tweaked 6-button controller. They had an analog controller that looked very awkward to hold, and then for the Dreamcast, they made something decent, but the wire came out of the bottom, like the masochists they are. It takes a big ego to make a controller that goes against the conventional standards, and who doesn't have a bigger ego than Microsoft? They made a controller bigger than an infant. The Duke, as it was nicknamed, was a beast, and I had this as a child, and I gotta say, It was kind of comfortable. You think I have little bitch hands now? Just look at me as a child. Those things didn't stand a chance. You see, this is why I bully my childhood self through the pictures on my wall, but then I create a paradox where I remember my childhood bully looking like me in my 20s. So that's why that happened! Oh my god! Microsoft would later come out with a refined Xbox controller called the S-Type controller, and it was a step in the right direction, seeing as the generation after they would make sex as a controller. Ah, the Xbox 360 controller. It's the only controller that can really make me scream at a D-pad. This thing just doesn't cut it, and my standards have been low for D-pads for about 30 seconds now. It's so mushy, I hate it, but this controller just melts in my hands. It's the perfect size for anybody. All the buttons are easily accessible, and man, I like using the thing. Now, Nintendo, on the other hand, had decided to harken back to the DVD movie games day and make a TV remote. And yet, you can't change the channel. God, where's my son to get up and change the TV when I need him? The Wii remote. It's something. I mean, it does work. It's just such an odd controller when you think about it. The pointer feature works really well for the time, and the motion controls, well, they needed a butt plug to function properly, but they functioned. You had a port at the bottom for a nunchuck and other various accessories, but I'm surprised other things didn't utilize this thing. Like, why not make more controllers for the Virtual Console? That would have been really cool. I mean, the Wii remote is fine. It works as a pointer and as a controller when flipped horizontally. Now, you know it doesn't work when you flip it vertically. I've given the gamepad a hard time lately, but I mean, who wouldn't? It's ugly. But I will say, it is a good controller. It being big really helps justify the right stick being over the buttons, and the screen in the middle actually is a neat concept. I like this thing, and I think it really does work. However, I can't help but be reminded of this terrible offspring it created. Whoever designed this controller needs to really rethink their career path, become a lawyer, and sue themselves for this crime against society. The buttons being down in this corner don't work at all, and the triggers, they feel like they should be analog, but they're not. They're digital. It just feels so weird. Speaking of feeling weird, the Xbox One. It feels like the Xbox 360 controller, just a tad bit worse. It doesn't melt in my hands, it more so just sits on top of them. It's not a bad controller, it's just not as good at what came before it. Sony decided to rethink their controllers, and we got the DualShock 4, and man, I just can't smoothly use this controller. It feels so slim. Too slim, in fact. The sticks being next to each other is just also something that I never felt just worked great ergonomically. I feel like it was only like this on the DualShock 1 because they didn't want to compromise the original design of the PS1 controller. But even with the PS5, it stays the same, and it just, it doesn't feel that comfortable. You know, my thumbs touch a lot when I use this controller. You know, back when I had thumbs. Oh, I miss my thumbs. This was a terrible mistake. Now, the Switch has these cool little things called tiny controllers. The Joy-Con are pretty neat, but are also kind of weak. I think they're fine in the console when you're on the go, but you will never see me choose these controllers over a Pro controller. The buttons are small, the sticks are small, putting it on the side makes it so the shoulder buttons are small. It's just, they're so fucking small. The Switch Pro controller, on the other hand, is really good. Like the Xbox 360 controller, it just melts in my hand, and the buttons are bigger. Hallelujah! But how could I say hallelujah when I haven't grew my thumbs back or found the perfect controller? Man, it feels like through all of this, you would have thought I found one by now. Did I forget something? Oh my god. How could I forget? Controller, it's you that I game with as the memory card breaks itself. Why did that happen? I could never forget this thing. Mainly because the Smash community can't live without it, so we get it re-released every time a new Smash game is announced. But still, how could I not forget the GameCube controller? This controller is a work of art. The buttons are laid out so you know what you are pressing without even looking at it. The colors pop, and yes, it does indeed melt in my hands. This is truly my favorite controller. I never seem to have a bad experience with this controller, even if the games that I play with have control schemes. I didn't even grow up with this console. It came out when I was born. I grew up with the Wii, and yet this is my controller of choice. To me, this is the perfect controller, and anyone who disagrees is honestly pretty valid. I mean, that's the beauty of game controllers. You can have your own opinions, and that's pretty cool. However, what's not cool is the fact that I spent all my time talking about game controllers, that my hands are fully healed from the surgery. Well, I guess this is my life now. As I take off these bandages, I have to face the fact that I'm gonna live my life with thumbs. Okay, so if they didn't remove my thumbs, what did they remove? Oh my god, how did I notice they removed my foot?